Our Cincinnati, Ohio was founded in 1788 within a hill-lined basin along the north bank of the Ohio River. 80 years later, that basin overflowed with over 9,000 people per square mile, mainly represented by German and Irish immigrants. This modern view from Nathaniel Longworth's Eden residence is much different than the smoke-obscured view of 1870. The basin dwellers lived in pollution, filth, disease, and odor. Building codes and zoning ordinances were non-existent. The city lot was a can, and the buildings, like sardines, were crammed within. South of the Main Street incline typifies the disorder. Tenements and dwellings were squeezed amongst businesses like Moorlang Brewing on Elm, a stable on Race, and Lewis Bard's Tannery on Richard Street. It's understandable how a house fire could quickly engulf the area. Below the Fairview Incline house spreads the Mill Creek Valley separating Clifton Heights and Price Hill. The valley was adorned with a scattering of railroad yards, train depots, dwellings, slaughterhouses, and a temperamental creek. Men and women were locked into this landscape, working 12-hour days, 6 days a week, through sickness, weariness, and pain. They knew little else beyond grinding monotonous Victorian stone, hoping for prosperity's grace. Their respite was an evening meal with friends and family. Yet, they dreamt of vacations. They prayed for freedom. They yearned to escape the sordid basin. The CH&D's 1851 arrival began the exodus away from the basin for the most affluent toward clean country air. Pollution-free suburbs sprang up at Wyoming Park Place, Glendale, and Hartwell, all a 30-minute train ride from the downtown office. The upper middle class embarked toward the hills, hiring others to cut steps and quasi-medieval roads into the Queen's curling ridges. A trip up Mount Auburn in a 12-seat passenger wagon pulled by 4 stout horses took 2 hours. Old Man Winter rendered the trip impossible with snow and ice. The Street Railway Journal later remarked, "Few cities present to the street railway manager so many and such difficult problems." Cincinnati soap manufacturer Joseph Hill, a Mount Auburn resident and one of many hilltop land speculators, read of a Pittsburgh invention able to scale mountains. Mr. Hill arrived in Pittsburgh to see wagons on wedges gracefully ascending the heights. He returned to Cincinnati and regaled his friend George A. Smith, a well-known engineer and Mount Auburn property owner, of the Pittsburgh elevator. Eureka, they probably thought. We have a solution to our uphill problem. Joseph Hill and George Smith, later joined by James Doherty, kicked off Cincinnati's golden era of incline construction in the 1870s. Despite the second worst economic depression in U.S. history, 5 of the 9 proposals were built between 1871 and 1877 on the barren slopes of Mount Auburn, Price Hill, Clifton Heights, and Mount Adams. When the 10th proposed incline, Fairview, was built in the 1890s, Cincinnatians had been flourishing amongst the Queen's crowning heights for 20 years. The inclines had 2 tracks, stations, and platforms. The pilot with conductors, engineers, ticket agents, gatemen, and maintainers manned the incline. The top terminal was called the head house, which was the incline's nerve center containing machinery, offices, and supply rooms. The bottom terminal, or gatehouse, contained the ticket agent who welcomed passengers. The pilot watched over the incline from the head house while operating machinery via levers and foot pedals. The position demanded focus, keen eyesight, and a good feel. The tracks were illuminated by oil lamps and later electric lights at night. Uniquely, Mount Adams positioned the operator in a cupola directly above both tracks. The pilot was always in the public and newspaper spotlight. A Price Hill pilot accidentally moved the platform during loading in March 1891, causing Sister Cyril to fall 12 feet into the gatehouse pit. Incensed witnesses demanded mob justice in a strongly worded letter to the newspaper. Incidents like these were basis for William Price declaring Price Hill a dry community. Maintainers glamorously scampered about the incline, inspecting rails, ties, cables, sheaths while dodging platforms day or night, regardless of weather or illness. This safety ballet played endlessly for 76 years. The gatekeeper, ticket agent, and conductor were the public face of the incline. The gatekeeper kept an eye out for ne'er-do-wells while also assisting passengers onto the platform. The conductor rode the platform, collecting tickets, enjoying the view, and making sure hands and feet remained inside the cab. A substantial headhouse stone foundation secured the machinery against being pulled downhill. Offsetting the platforms on the incline permitted using smaller coal-fired boilers and steam engines. In other words, only the weight difference between platforms needed to be hoisted. This slide shows how the hoisting cable wound on the drums at Mount Auburn and Price Hill. As one drum winds, the other unwinds the cable. Mount Adams, Bellevue, and Fairview later added a second hoist cable to each platform. A safety cable was suspended from a balancing wheel that had an emergency brake mechanism the pilot could use to stop the platforms. The brake pad was generally made from oak or maple. Interestingly, Mount Auburn successfully used rubber hose pieces for brake material. The hoist cable wound over a 10 or 14 foot diameter oak drum carried on an iron shaft with large wooden end flanges capped by iron rings fitted with wooden gear teeth. The machinery was designed to prevent metal-on-metal friction damage. The winding drum gear teeth meshed with an iron pinion gear driven by a steam engine, which was powered by one of two coal-fired boiler sets. The second boiler set was held in reserve in case the first set failed or required maintenance. However, the incline had to be shut down for hours while the reserve boilers were brought online. Coal deliveries were initially made by wagon. Cincinnati Street Railway later introduced an electric 10-ton coal car to distribute coal from the Pendleton Power Plant to the Mount Adams, Bellevue, and Fairview headhouses. U-10 rode the incline like a streetcar. Unloading took place on a siding adjacent to the headhouse. Eventually, delivery trucks replaced U-10. Fixed iron sheaths and rollers prevented the ties from being cut in half by steel cables. Oiling the cables mitigated metal-on-metal friction damage. Occasionally, the pilot would jerk the controls, causing the cables to emit an otherworldly slapping sound. Strap iron rails were not used on the inclines due to the need for constant repair and lower carrying capacity. T-rails were favored from the outset as they were proven to be superior in performance and construction. Mount Auburn, Bellevue, and Mount Adams were built with iron rails, whereas Fairview and both Price Hill inclines were built with steel rails. Bellevue switched to steel rail in September 1883, Mount Adams in 1890, and Mount Auburn in 1890. Steel often replaced iron when new, heavier platforms were installed. Inclines constructed in the 1870s used enclosed platforms that closely resembled a streetcar mounted on a wedge-shaped iron frame truck carried by 4 or more iron wheel sets. Loading the platform occurred at the end via a door, or as seen with the Bellevue platform or porch. Price Hill's cream and red black-roofed platforms were named Highland Mary and Lily of the Valley after William Price's sisters. George Kerper's Mount Adams platforms honored Nathaniel Longworth and Martin Baum. However, the closed platforms required cumbersome station transfers. The Price Hill Freight Incline introduced open platforms in 1877 that added operational versatility. Oak flooring capped longer, heavily constructed iron frame trucks on 3 to 4 iron wheel sets. Iron guardrails with end gates allowed passenger and cargo wagons to be hoisted in the same trip. Horse-drawn streetcars also joined the retinue. Main Street joined the open platform party in 1878, followed by Mount Adams in 1880 and Bellevue in 1890. All for the same reason, hauling carriages, streetcars, and wagons. This unique 1905 photo not only captures the Bellevue open platforms meeting over Clifton Avenue. If you look closely at the right truck, a man is sitting in the frame. It's unknown if he's stealing a ride or just a tired employee. Fairview's open platforms were built to efficiently handle electric streetcars. Closed platforms were retrofitted in 1921 after inspectors declared the incline was unsafe for electric streetcars. This is how men and their machines brought Cincinnati forth from the basin. Mount Auburn was a trendy mid-1800s locale that lacked convenient, reliable transportation. By June 1867, the Mount Auburn Street Railway horse-powered service was minimally better than climbing the stairs. Joseph Hill convinced George Smith that the Pittsburgh elevator would solve their uphill woes while helping them sell posh hilltop real estate. When James Doherty accepted George Smith's invitation, the experimental startup was guaranteed success by adding the street railway executive's expertise. The Cincinnati Incline plane was incorporated on April 21, 1871, with a dormant railroad charter that granted some immunity from local oversight. George Smith, as the supermajority shareholder and principal financial backer, keenly understood street railways and inclines were a risky investment. His railroad was worthless without connections. In December 1871, Mount Auburn ownership somehow persuaded Cincinnati to waive its street railway franchise process and approved a connection with downtown from the Incline. Construction also began with the first 320 feet built into the earth before reaching a peculiar humpback trestle that caused excessive wear and strain on the cables. A continuous slope would have been better, but it's easy to see this option required more excavation time and money. Property owner lawsuits and construction difficulties delayed opening day until May 12, 1872, on which over 6,000 riders spent a nickel for a 90-second trip up Mount Auburn, while thousands more crowded about to watch this experimental marvel of engineering. Let's visualize an 1870s Mount Auburn incline trip as retold in Richard Wagner and Roy Wright's Cincinnati Streetcars series. The lower station was a modest frame building on Mulberry Street that did not convey the faintest suggestion of being a depot. On entering the building, you saw a queer-looking streetcar that reminded you of a kangaroo. The rear of the conveyance sat on stilts 6 or 8 feet high, while the front almost touched the ground. There were 2 cars, 2 parallel tracks. The cars were connected to each other by a wire rope, so that in passage up and down, one car balanced the other. Otherwise, the cars were like ordinary streetcars. You entered the one at the bottom. The conductor telegraphed the engineer at the top. He telegraphed back, "All right," and the ascent began. You went slowly at first few seconds, and suddenly the speed increased, and you were whizzing up the hillside like the flight of a bird. Midway through flight, you met the other car coming down, but it passed like a flash. In a minute and a half, you were 1,000 feet from where you started and 250 feet higher. The Celestial Depot, name of the station at the top, was a brick structure that looked more like a steamboat than anything else. It contained the engines and machinery for driving the cars. Stepping out of the cars, you saw the finest view of the entire city that could ever be seen anywhere. Over 1 million tickets were sold that first year. The neighboring Mount Auburn Street Railroad was purchased from foreclosure in late 1872 for use as a temporary solution to reach downtown until the Main Street line was opened in May 1873. Once again, Cincinnati waived the franchise procedure to allow the purchase. George Smith, as a Cincinnati Zoo shareholder, caused the Incline to purchase zoo stock after it opened in September 1875. Cincinnati gave the Incline Street operation permission to extend a route from the Incline to the zoo via the now routine expedited process. Cincinnati leadership had spoiled Mount Auburn into believing it could do anything. However, violating city ordinance by operating a Baldwin steam dummy locomotive in 1877 on the streets was a step too far. A year after the unsuccessful steam dummy trial, the plane was renovated to reduce the humpback trestle and introduce open platforms. Soon freight wagons and private carriages were hoisted by the Incline. However, high fares, poor service, thuggish employees, and managerial malaise caused public opinion to shift against the Incline over the next decade. In 1880, Cincinnati sought revenge with a lawsuit to invalidate the Mount Auburn Railroad franchise over unpaid fees. George Smith's 1888 death placed the Incline's future in jeopardy as his estate wanted to divest the risky asset. Hill and Doherty lacked funds to buy Smith's lot. Even Cincinnati Street Railway passed. But a downstream suitor's interest was piqued. Hardin Littell's Louisville Syndicate bought the flagging railroad in late 1888. Hardin was a street railway man who immediately recognized the operation needed 2 things: modernization and his brother Harvey's operational expertise. The Littells engaged Richmond, Virginia electric railway entrepreneur Frank Sprague to build electric streetcars in November 1888 and power equipment in January 1889. Only the steel cables were replaced on the Incline in 1889. The heavier, larger electric cars barely fit onto the platforms. The Littells ignored an engineer's warning that the machinery could not handle the shiny new cars, and so they went over the incline with a cat-like, "If I fits, I sits," in June 1889. An inexperienced motorman pulled through the headhouse onto the awaiting platform on July 15, 1889. In an instant, the electric car smashed through the platform guardrails, catapulting man and machine onto the incline. The motorman and 4 others were injured. In response, the open platforms were replaced with lighter fixed cabins to prevent another mishap. The incline lost valuable haulage revenue from wagons and carriages. However, lost revenue was soon to be the least of everyone's concern. Pilot Charles Goebel slammed his body weight upon the control lever, hoping a troublesome steam valve would shut down the engines before the uphill platform collided with the headhouse on October 15, 1889. His Herculean effort failed, causing glass shards and splinters to spew across the headhouse. The loose safety cable slipped from the platform, causing it to fall until grabbed by the hoist cable being pulled over the winding drum. Employees strained against the jammed iron gates, hoping to save the passengers. Finally, the partially closed steam valve gave out. The hoist cable unwound, sending the occupied platform downhill in a maelstrom of smoke, screeches, and screams. Gatehouse conductor Mr. Johnson hurriedly disembarked passengers from the lower platform area. His mission was just completed an instant before the doomed platform exploded across Main Street, showering bystanders in unspeakable horrors. Rescuers dashed upon the wreckage to discover several dead and severely wounded. Agnes Hochstetter, Professor Michael Neese, Mrs. Ives, Mrs. Schaefer, Joseph McFadden, and Judge William Dickinson were among those killed. The coroner declared the Littell brothers' crestfallen operation criminally negligent for ignoring the engineer's earlier recommendation. It required $200,000, or today $76 million, to repair the dilapidated headhouse, power plant gatehouse, open platforms, and reduce the humpback again. All work was finished by February 9, 1890. Engineer George Hornung redesign could not fix the incline's reputation. Another 1891 mishap only served to spread more distrust. However, Harvey Littell used his charm to win riders back. Harvey departed for a New Orleans startup just before the 1893 Depression. A December 1893 headhouse murder further darkened public perception. Within months, the Ohio Supreme Court ended the decades-long franchise license battle with Cincinnati by finding the Incline owed everything Cincinnati claimed with interest. Harvey Littell's replacement, Mr. Bradford, hoped a positive review from the Roebling Company in 1895 would brighten public perception and boost ridership. Roebling's review landed like a soggy pancake. Mounting debt forced Bradford to suspend interest payments to the Louisville syndicate bankers in July 1895. Cincinnati Street Railway simultaneously made silent buyout overtures. The last attempt was $350,000, or today $110 million, in July 1897. Bradford defiantly declined the offers. Panicked Louisville bankers did not share Bradford's stoicism, offering the street railway their mortgage bonds. However, Ohio law forbid mergers between parallel streetcar lines. Charles Kilgore, street railway owner, used Grandmaster 5D chess skills to buy the company on April 14, 1898 for $278,000, or today $93.9 million. The Kilgores were only interested in the valuable street railway franchise, not the Incline. On June 4, 1898, the platform stopped, boilers fell silent, and a sign appeared, "Temporarily closed for repairs, never to reopen." While the Incline was beloved, its management was sometimes not. George Smith's tenure ended in malaise. The Littell-era fatal accident sullied the Incline so severely it was never able to recover its glory. Ultimately, spite closed the Incline. Cincinnatians can still see traces of the Incline's path by venturing up the WPA-built concrete stairs. Our beloved Western Height was named after General Reese Price, who owned several hilltop acres along with a brick and lumber yard at the base. General Price was a self-made man who famously rejected his wife's large dowry as he had not earned it. William, the general's son, found selling property on the isolated hilltop tough due to the flood-prone Mill Creek, lack of street railway to downtown, and the steep eastern slope. Stitching wooden stairs and primitive roads into the hillside made it barely passable. Later, ornery rock-hurling boys assaulted the passenger platforms from those wooden stairs until William had them removed. William later claimed planning for the elevator, as he preferred to call it, began in 1870 to remove one of three barriers separating Price Hill from Cincinnati. A single incline plane, gatehouse headhouse with community rooms, entertainment house, and gardens were planned with overwhelming support from other hilltop land speculators. Cincinnati gave permission in 1872 for a tunnel under Warsaw Avenue. It's unclear if William and his brother John were involved, but we can surmise the project had hilltop support. Regardless, the tunnel never happened. Peter Filsner sold William Price hillside land between 8th Street and modern-day Olden View Park for the Incline project. Charles Filsner, Peter's son, started construction in spring 1874 by plunging a ceremonial pick into the hillside. Charles remained with the Price Hill Incline until 1922. William used his father's wealth and building material business to push construction forward during the Long Depression. Building upon private land alleviated landowner lawsuits and limited city oversight. In fact, William only needed city permission for two things: bridging over Warsaw Avenue and Price Hill Road, and establishing a street railway from the gatehouse to downtown on 8th Street. Over 2,000 people attended the private 3 p.m. grand opening ceremony in the lavish Price Hill Gardens on July 14, 1875. Brand's orchestra gave ambiance while accolades and gifts were presented, including a fine incline drawing, portraits of the Price men, and a silver service. Meanwhile, overwhelmed conductors stopped asking for tickets, allowing everyone to ride the pride of Price Hill. The Incline Head House, with its 100-foot-tall observatory, music hall, and art space, was one of many features attracting people to Price Hill. General Price's brick and lumber yards were soon delivering materials to new homes being constructed on the hill. William and John recognized a second incline with open platforms would be a very lucrative investment. Freight incline construction began in 1876 just north of the passenger incline. The head house was extended to include a dedicated freight incline machinery set. The bottom pit was simply guarded with a gate. The robust freight incline opened April 19, 1877. The platforms moved 3 to 4 loaded wagons every 3 minutes. A transloading agreement with the CH&D brought even more business. Freight wagon queues extending several blocks established the freight incline's importance to Price Hill's development. George and Reese McDuffie bought the incline from their Uncle William on October 1, 1878, with Uncle John remaining as general manager. The McDuffie brothers incorporated the railroad in 1884 after receiving a street railway franchise from Cincinnati to operate on Price Hill, which they in turn sold to the Cincinnati Street Railway for a 35% cut of the line's revenue. The McDuffie steady management gave Price Hill residents a decade of golden service. Highlights include electric lighting and new passenger platforms in 1886. The freight platforms, tracks, and machinery were replaced the next year. The system even ran smoothly through the 1893 Depression. 1894 was the high water mark, with 1.5 million riders plying the passenger incline. On September 30, 1894, horse-drawn streetcars for the St. Lawrence Church superstructure dedication were hoisted by the freight incline for the first time. 1895 brought another depression and a new competing Cincinnati Street Railway electric car route. The street railway threatened to build a new incline north of the Price Hill operation after failing to get concessions from the McDuffies. Ohio coupled on the Angst train when, after 20 years, it started to enforce Sunday blue laws, forcing the Price Hill House to shut down and ridership to plummet 50%. A dog alerted its owner to a fire spreading across the head house's top floor in the wee hours of July 18, 1895. 4 Cincinnati firefighter companies were summoned from the valley. However, their journey took 2 hours up hillside roads as the freight incline was shut down. Thankfully, they arrived in time to limit damage to the upper head house floors. I'm sure the dog got lots of belly rubs and a nice treat. Within 2 years of the fire, the Cincinnati Street Railway had surrounded the incline with bypassing routes that eroded incline ridership. The street railway followed up with several takeover offers that were summarily rejected. The brisk CH&D interchange business was the saving grace, keeping the lights on while permitting a boiler upgrade and steel cable replacement. The street railway got Mayor Dempsey's blessing in March 1906 to tunnel through Price Hill for an extension of the 8th Street line. Mayor Dempsey was disappointed by engineers declaring the tunnel idea impractical. Later, on a crisp October 1st, 1906 morning, Mayor Dempsey's carriage driver opted to take the Price Hill freight incline, much to his chagrin. Later that morning, Joseph Strassel and Edward Brisker drove their manure-laden wagons onto the gatehouse platform. 750 feet into the ascent, the cables creaked, groaned, then let loose with a violent snap! The platform began a downhill slide that hastened by the second. Strassel looked at Brisker before they somersaulted into their manure loads. The platform crashed into the bottom pit, sending the wagons and horses asunder. Miraculously, Strassel and Brisker were saved by the cow dung. The horses were instantly killed and immediately removed to a rendering factory. Bystanders brushed off Strassel and bought him a few beers, while Brisker was attended by a doctor. The accident caused coal prices to spike for Hilltop residents and also forcing detours. Increased freight wagon traffic damaged Cincinnati Street railway tracks on Elberon Avenue. The 8th Street line was overwhelmed, but the passenger incline experienced a slight rider boost. It became obvious the freight incline was a critical link for the community when it reopened on January 22, 1907. A later nighttime derailment stranding 2 men in wagons for several hours caused some to consider alternatives to using the freight incline. More freight incline closures came in 1908 and 1910 after damaging mudslides. Perhaps the 1910 closure spurred council to pave the eastern slope roads in 1912, breaking the incline's freight monopoly. However, some like Kroger delivery driver Pickles still enjoyed the freight incline and its views. The truck he drove in February 1915 thought it could climb the incline without a platform when it entered the gatehouse pit, causing another shutdown. The incline was valued at $107,000, or today $24.7 million, in 1914. 3 years later, its value had declined to $32,300, or $5 million today. It was clear the operation had passed its prime and was suffering from Cincinnati Street Railway competition. Perhaps these factors spurred the McDuffies to sell the family heirloom to Cincinnati Councilman Charles Rose on December 1, 1919. Mr. Rose increased fares the following year to stabilize finances. Ridership held steady through the Roaring Twenties. However, the freight incline was shuttling vehicles every 6 minutes, a far cry from its 1880s 3-minute standard. In May 1926, the street railway made the first of 2 attempts to send a bus down the freight incline. Each time, the platform sagged under the weight, causing frightened passengers to flee through the emergency exit. Within a year, Charles Rose offered the freight incline to the street railway, comically suggesting the incline would improve bus service and reduce costs. When the passenger incline steam engines were replaced with Westinghouse electric motors in 1928, passengers were detoured over the aging freight incline. This was the final hurrah, as it was forever closed in December 1929, yet the passenger incline soldiered forth. Those within walking distance saw the incline as a daily necessity. Those beyond Price Hill saw it as a novelty. Despite the perception differences, Charles Rose successfully operated the incline through the Depression with 318,000 riders in 1936. However, the deferred maintenance plan caught up with Mr. Rose on July 31, 1943. An astute pilot halted the rising passenger platform immediately after noticing the rails spread when a rotten tie snapped. His quick action allowed passengers to be rescued unscathed. This was the last trip of the incline, as city inspectors found extensive repairs were required that cost beyond what Mr. Rose could afford. The street railway refused Price Hill residents' request to purchase and restore the operation. The public turned to the city for salvation in January 1945. However, city manager W.R. Kellogg ended the dream on August 31, 1945, after reconstruction bids came in twice the estimated amount. The head house remained for 8 years until meeting Mr. Wrecking Ball in 1953. Remains of the incline are still visible today from Glenway Avenue, Warsaw Avenue, and the Olden View. Cincinnati's eastern mount is an iconic backdrop to downtown Cincinnati that, in 1870, was soon to become a key gateway and future streetcar battleground. Edward Shield began the Mount Adams and Eden Park Incline Plane Company on June 26, 1873, with James Mooney's investment. Shield was a machinist who understood the complexities of machinery, but not city government. Plans and progress initially set off at a frenetic pace, but quickly halted thanks to city bureaucrats. Cincinnati demanded Shield stop construction over Kilgore, Baum, and Oregon streets, as he had not sought city approval. The city also demanded a station accessible from Baum Street for passengers. By October 4, 1874, the upper right-of-way from Locke Street near Fifth Avenue to Celestial Street was purchased. The head house, along with a few piers and a portion of the trestle, were also finished. Property owners along the lower incline delayed construction by taking their financial grievances to court. James Mooney replaced Shield with his friend George Kerper as president in July 1875. Edward Shield remained active until poor health forced him to retire just after the incline opened. Kerper was known as a quick, active man of untiring energy and possessed of clear, accurate judgment. Kerper hired a Pennsylvania incline engineer who got the head house machinery designed and installed by November 1875. City Council decided to hold Kerper to Shield's promised mid-station requirement, but Council relented after Kerper convinced them the station would become a death sentence. The lower third of the incline was finally built into Mount Adams with a wooden gatehouse added soon after. The upper segment was carried on a substantial trestle with iron bridges over Kilgore, Baum, and Oregon streets. Streetcar lines were planned to extend to downtown and Mount Lookout because a railroad is nothing without connections. Mount Adams opened on March 11, 1876. George Kerper spent the next 2 years putting his streetcar lines into operation. He soon realized transferring passengers from closed platform to streetcar was time-consuming. The successful Price Hill freight plane, a Hoboken operation, and local pressure caused Kerper to switch toward open platforms. Kerper hired Henry Lane and Bert Baldwin to redesign the machinery to handle wagons and streetcars. A machinery failure in July 1879 caused Kerper to shut down the operation. He was keenly aware successful operation depended on public confidence. Soon engineers from the other inclines were crawling throughout the head house basement with their every action recorded by a reporter. Carefully crafted public relations was core to Kerper's success. The $100,000, or today $44.1 million overhaul began in October 1879 and debuted in May 1880 with an enlarged plane, all new head house, gatehouse, and open platforms. The public was delighted to see streetcars, carriages, and wagons flow over Mount Adams every 2 minutes and 20 seconds for 19 hours a day. In an emergency, the trip could be made in 1 minute. The incline hoisted fire wagons from downtown to save hilltop structures, including the head house. Pilot Chris Hollinger stayed at the helm to hoist Cincinnati's finest several times to battle the blaze that soon enclosed his position, causing severe burns. Hollinger saved the head house, and doctors saved his life. The public endeared George Kerper with monikers like the Little Giant, King Kerper, and Cable Car Kerper, who used this sentiment to great effect during the post-Depression Railroad Street War between himself, John Kilgore's Consolidated Street Railway, and the needling George Smith. While tensions still simmered with George Smith, Kerper and Kilgore resolved their differences by Kilgore taking a 25% stake and board seat in December 1881. Kerper and Kilgore would go on to have a productive relationship. The incline was indispensable to Mount Adams, allowing Rookwood Pottery to offer free children's pottery classes. A fire alarm was installed in 1896, alerting the pilot to hold a platform for approaching fire apparatus. The open platform also allowed King Kerper to try new things. U.S. mail service was added in July 1887, followed by an unsuccessful electric streetcar experiment. The latter caused John Kilgore to insist the Kerper Road become electrified in 1889. 20 Pullman coaches were ordered in September 1889, followed by several typical streetcars. The Mount Auburn experience showed another renovation was necessary. During George Kerper's last year as president, he paid for the city's orphans to enjoy a meal and a trip to Eden Park, and began electrification of the Kerper Road before retiring in January 1890. A thankful public gave George Kerper a silver service for his dedication to public transit. John Kilgore quietly became majority shareholder by January 1890, when an unsupportive Mount Adams board caused George Kerper's ouster. Soon, Mount Adams and Cincinnati Street Railway shared officers and board members. John Kilgore still experienced competitive conflict from the Kerper sector that nearly caused him to resign in 1893 over a streetcar routing dispute that threatened to disrupt a James Mooney-backed real estate syndicate. Engineer Bert Baldwin was tapped to replace his 10-year-old design with machinery that would last until 1948 to hoist larger open platforms. Reconstruction began in November 1890 and was completed in February 1891. A bollard was later added to the platform to prevent streetcars from rolling away. This feature prevented several accidents. Ohio law prevented the Cincinnati Street Railway and Kerper Road from merging. Kilgore backed a lobbying effort resulting in 1896's Rogers Act that reversed the anti-merger law. On August 1, 1896, the predator swallowed the prey. Mount Adams kids used the Incline as a playground. Little Charles Kinney and other boys climbed a Baum Street trestle to peep through the tracks. It was all fun and games until a passing platform bombed Charles' noggin. Little Charles survived with a cut and an important life lesson. While Mount Adams never suffered a passenger death, 5 employees were killed in the line of duty. A macabre news article recounted James Covalt working in the passing zone, unaware the incline was put into operation. James Covalt was not as fortunate as little Charles Kinney. On another evening, 2 women, one pregnant, were stranded on the platform after the gatekeeper mindlessly told the pilot the platform could be hoisted halfway up for the evening. They screamed for hours until a policeman organized a rescue down the chicken ladder. Sadly, the absent-minded mistake caused a miscarriage. The Incline operated around minor shutdowns in 1903 and 1906, a protracted 1913 labor dispute, and declining ridership. The decision was made in 1920 to alter the platforms again to handle longer streetcars and more automobiles. The platforms were slowed to 4.5 miles an hour to minimize machinery wear. The Bellevue Inclines machinery became a frequent part source for Superintendent Forrest Himes's midnight repairs. Streetcar number 246 was the last to travel over the Incline on July 25, 1947, when the Samuel Hannaford-designed Eden Park Bridge was condemned. The Cincinnati Traction Company opted to tear it down versus repairing it, exclaiming, "We're broke!" Automobiles, trucks, and buses became standard riders until an April 16, 1948 inspection caused the familiar "Closed for repairs" sign to be hung. The traction company once again cried, "We're broke!" and closed the Incline. Mount Adams residents demanded city intervention that was stymied forever when Mayor Cash said the city didn't have any to fix the Incline, and so it sat derelict until scrappers claimed it for cash in 1952. The head house survived 2 more years before meeting Mr. Wrecking Ball. I-471 construction claimed the gatehouse, the last Cincinnati Incline structure, in 1974. Remains of the fabled Incline can still be seen today from Oregon and Kilgore Streets. The Long Depression had slowed Cincinnati's growth to a crawl, but it did not quell desire in Clifton for another incline. Mount Auburn's incline made travel to Clifton easier, but residents along the southern precipice, or Elysian Clifton, were isolated. L.C. Hopkins led an investment group in October 1874 that proposed an incline from Race Street and over the Rhine to Ohio Avenue in Elysian Clifton, on property just east of the future University of Cincinnati, with a head house attraction in Elysian Clifton. Interestingly, Mr. Hopkins also wanted to build a second incline just west of Ravine Street to Fairview Heights. Mr. Hopkins' sales pitch included faster access to the future Cincinnati Zoo and Burnett Woods. Streetcar tracks laid in Elm Street caused the lower station to be moved away from Race Street. The Cincinnati and Clifton Incline Plane Railroad was incorporated on June 17, 1875, by noted streetcar guys Keck, Seasongood, and Worth, with financial backing from W. J. Lippincott and Benjamin Evans. It's not clear if L. C. Hopkins was involved in 1875. Construction began around November 3, 1875, on property purchased from Robert Brown and George Graham along the west side of UC. 40 men began digging the roadbed and building the gatehouse foundation. Wishful thinking declared operations would start in May 1876. The lower and upper ends were built into the earth with a trestle and 65-foot iron bridge over Clifton Avenue linking the segments. A gentle curve allowed the lower 20% grade to meet the upper 33% grade, making the incline 980 feet long. The headhouse machinery was designed by Cincinnatian Henry Lane of Lane and Bodley. Elysia and Clifton celebrated the grand opening of Cincinnati's fourth incline on September 5, 1876. 5 days later, the fledgling incline was taxed with transporting 100 people per platform to celebrate Bellevue house opening. Several pauses occurred later that week to adjust the stretched-out steel cables. 6 days later, the Upper Street Railway connected to the headhouse, causing another traffic surge. The incline averaged 12,000 riders per day in that first year, but not all riders were pleased. A row played out in the newspapers between riders claiming the incline was the safest and best operated in Cincinnati. Others complained it minimized rider safety for profit, citing 2 September accidents, including a pilot blaming rough platform handling on a tobacco wad. That smokescreen was quickly dispelled. UC students joined the dissenters after continuous noisy passing platforms interrupted class. Some gentlemen saw fit to wave cadaver parts or toss fingers and toes at the passing platforms. Strongly worded letters to the university stopped the digital distributions. Kilgore Brothers had control over the Cincinnati Street Railway by the end of the Long Depression. Lawyer Ike Miller did much to expose the brothers' Grandmaster 5D chess moves using surrogates to make multiple fly bids on streetcar franchises to make the process appear fair. However, Miller's work pushed John and Charles Kilgore toward their ultimate goal: consolidation. June 1880 newspapers carried stories of Kilgorean maneuvers to consolidate several streetcar lines that include the Price Hill Incline connected to the 8th Street route and the Bellevue Incline, which were owned by the Lippincott-Evans Syndicate. Maybe this spooked a horse into bucking off its rider below the Clifton Avenue Incline Bridge. On July 1, 1880, the new consolidated company was formed, with the Kilgores retaining the majority. Bellevue Incline gave them a coveted direct connection to Clifton, Burnett Woods, and the zoo. They also began to poach business from the sleepy Mount Auburn Incline. Bellevue was a good investment, as ridership had grown to 1.2 million people by 1886. Some trouble was had the next year when the gatehouse stables collapsed on Mr. Browning, requiring his leg to be amputated. Mr. Browning sued the street railway for $30,000 or $1 million today. The jury, while sympathetic to Mr. Browning, gave the judgment to the street railway. Mr. Browning filed another lawsuit, with John Kilgore countering with a lifetime watchman position and the best artificial leg available, which Mr. Browning accepted. Ridership dropped in February 1889 when the street railway's Vine Street cable line began service. It is possible John Kilgore intended the Vine Street to become the passenger artery and the incline to mirror the Price Hill Freight Incline by incorporating open platforms to haul wagons, carriages, and electric streetcars. John Kilgore believed electric was the future for Clifton. Soon, engineer Bert Baldwin was redesigning the incline to support his electric streetcar vision. A fatal Vine Street cable line accident on July 14, 1889, followed by the July 15 Mount Auburn accident, caused ridership to increase until the fatal October 15 Mount Auburn accident caused Cincinnatians to hit the streets and make like it was 1869. Bellevue's planned November shutdown came at the right time to save it from a wary public. Bert Baldwin's plan included resloping the upper plane to accommodate longer open platforms, causing the incline to become 1,020 feet long. Headhouse machinery was replaced with 500 horsepower boilers and engines akin to those used at Mount Adams. The wood gatehouse met Mr. Wrecking Ball and was replaced with a grand brick gatehouse. The incline reopened in September 1890 to accept almost everything Cincinnati could offer. Implementing electric streetcar service on Clifton Avenue required another machinery upgrade in 1892. Kilgore's prolonged squabble with nemesis Ike Miller had delayed the electric changeover 2 years. The service was opened on July 2nd, 1892, to an incredible fanfare of residents lining Clifton streets watching two well-decorated electric streetcars descend the incline. On July 30, 1893, the uphill platform was loaded with a streetcar and wagon carrying wooden beams that prevented shutting the rear gates. A miscommunication from the gatekeeper caused the platform's departure, with the rear gate swinging in the breeze, only to be struck by the other platform over Clifton Avenue. Visions of the Mount Auburn accident elicited riders' screams that were answered by a panicked police officer who encouraged them to jump for your lives! Thankfully, no one did, but the incident was litigated in the newspaper for weeks. The 1890 and 1892 renovations allowed the incline to morph into a freight juggernaut second only to Price Hill. Freight receipts in 1902 were $7,800 against $1,000 from passengers. In fact, Bellevue earned 12 times more than Fairview and 1.5 times more than Mount Adams. Coal, building materials, foodstuffs, and beer were hauled up to Clifton every day. The 1925 Cincinnati traction reorganization did not include Bellevue Incline, causing an uproar from Cliftonites demanding the plane be refurbished for downtown streetcar service. The traction company declared balderdash, claiming the incline was a financial black hole. The Elysians doubled down on being marooned without an incline. The traction company threw up its hands, crying, "We're broke!" The last North Slope incline fell silent on June 6, 1925, nearly 28 years after Mount Auburn's closure. Cincinnatians can find the remaining incline bridge pier on Clifton Avenue and the Gatehouse Pit area on McMicken Avenue at Elm Street. Every good railroad story needs a tycoon and a dash of hubris. The competition to control streetcar Route 23 and the Fairview Incline contains both. Ike Miller proposed Route 23 from downtown to Cumminsville via his Fairview Heights neighborhood in 1890. His plan took an indirect route along real estate held by a syndicate before reaching Cincinnati Street Railway occupied Clifton Avenue. Simultaneously, John Kilgore's Cincinnati Street Railway was planning an electric streetcar service on Clifton Avenue with a stub into Miller's neighborhood. Cincinnati law required public bids for streetcar routes or franchises, so lawyer Ike Miller conveniently wrote the ordinance for council that included an incline on his property between McMicken and Fairview Avenues, along with other favorable stipulations. He also exploited council's concerns about the growing Kilgorean monopoly. City Council addressed the Kilgore-Miller plan separately in August 1890, leading Team Miller to assail Council with every known politically divisive tactic to favor Route 23 over Kilgore's Clifton Avenue plan. The Kilgore hyperfixation allowed a George Kerper ally to enter the fracas, lawyer Simeon Johnson. John Kilgore did not bid on Route 23, leaving it to Miller and Johnson. Ike Miller played his property ownership card to beat Johnson, but Johnson beat feet to court to pause Miller's subterfuge. Route 23 competition stories filled newspapers with every party bashing the other, causing the public to wonder why the route was necessary or even important. Johnson's temporary judicial win became permanent. Miller responded by lobbying the Ohio legislature to invalidate Cincinnati's franchise ordinance by requiring property owner consent along a proposed route. Again, Miller's property syndicate owned most of the lots along Route 23. The franchise usurpation failed, leaving Johnson's group in control. Simeon Johnson worked hard to finally get Ike Miller's written commitment to sell his property on February 23, 1892. In early July, Johnson's charade vanished when an ally revealed Simeon Johnson was, in fact, working for John Kilgore. Ike Miller cried foul, forcing another Route 23 bidding process that was won by Miller, but his bid was invalidated over a legal technicality, giving the franchise back to John Kilgore. And that is how you play 5D chess. Engineer Burt Baldwin designed the plane and machinery for electric streetcar service. Materials from the second Bellevue Incline renovation in as many years were used to build Fairview. 207 of the 700-foot length were built into the hillside, with the remainder on a trestle. The head house was a two-story wood frame on stone foundation building, including the pilot's booth, machinery, passenger waiting room, office, and restroom. A hilltop attraction was never considered, as the Incline was a utilitarian machine to haul streetcars. Fairview Heights Incline opened on August 4, 1894, to what was described as a country fair with two circuses. Even the antagonistic Ike Miller joined the festivities while introducing a tavern near the attractionless head house. The system ran without a hitch, even through the 1901 hostile takeover attempt by East Coast-based Whitney Elkins Widener Syndicate. John and Charles Kilgore used their Grandmaster 5D chess skills to convince the syndicate leasing as a better option. Thus, the Cincinnati Traction Company was formed to take over operations in exchange for a guaranteed revenue cut. Fairview was accident-free until February 27, 1905 snowstorm blinded motorman William Baker's approach to the Incline. Citing an empty gatehouse pit triggered Mr. Baker's instinctual brake application, followed with a spirited dash toward the rear exit. His cat-like reaction saved his life, but severe injuries required bystanders to hoist him from the pit wreckage by rope. In 1908, the Traction Company inaugurated a crosstown line from the west side to Clifton via the Route 23 occupied Incline. Extra streetcar traffic snarled about the Incline, causing unacceptable delays on both lines. Route 23 changed course to an adjacent street, giving preference to the immensely popular crosstown line, and so the Incline operated unabated for 13 years. Sources differ if Burt Baldwin or city inspectors forced the Incline's closure on August 27, 1921, after discovering the structure was unsafe. The Traction Company balked at repairs, crying, "We're broke!" Fairview Heights residents immediately pressured City Council for action during the 1921 general election. Government funds covertly slipped to the Traction Company to cover repairs that included retrofitting a fixed cab on the platform. The secret got out during the 1922 general election, giving candidates political fodder. The fixed cabs delayed the valuable crosstown line. Meanwhile, the Traction Company was experimenting with buses, leading them to approach the city with a novel scheme. Cincinnati agreed with the Traction Company's offer to provide $85,000, or $10.9 million today, to extend McMillan Street between Mill Creek Valley and Fairview Heights. The crosstown line was carried by bus via McMillan, allowing the Incline to be permanently closed on December 24, 1923, after 29 years of service. Cincinnati became known as the Paris of America, thanks in part to the hilltop attractions built adjacent to the Inclines. George Smith hedged building an attraction next to the Mount Auburn head house would boost ridership on their risky Incline experiment. Ergo, what became known as Lookout House was an insurance policy. The building was a bland design with a phenomenal view. The basin excitedly watched the lookout box grow from Jackson Hill. George Kemeter was hired away from Burnett House to open the Bland Monument on December 8, 1872, with music provided by Courier's celebrated brass band. George Smith's trend-setting gambit worked, drawing riders and profits to the Incline. Price Hill, Bellevue, and Mount Adams followed with their own head house attractions, taking advantage of different city vistas while offering a variety of entertainment, filling newspapers with their best promotions. A Cincinnatian enjoying a beer at Highland House described his Gemütlichkeit, or happy fellowship, to a reporter.
To sit on the brow of that hill on a balmy summer evening, to look out on the city beneath with its streets patterned by rows of light, with the ferry boats and packets on the river, the Kentucky hills outlined shadowy in the distance, to breathe the invigorating air. Ah, that was to bid adieu to the cares and worries of the everyday world, and to fondle a stein of foamy beer, to have, when desired, a light lunch or a full meal, to listen to the best music. Well, that came pretty nearly to being a foretaste of heaven to me.
By 1875, injured Civil War veteran Frank Harf was a beloved over-the-Rhine saloon proprietor with a penchant for novelty that caught George Smith's eye. George Kemeter and Pal Loring were given the old heave-ho in favor of Frank Harf. Lookout House expanded to have a pavilion, dining hall, music hall, gardens, and a pool hall. Frank Harf's tenure was not disappointing. In June 1877, Cincinnatian A.A. Stewart paid $10,000, or today $309,000, for a living beluga to be displayed in Cincinnati. Frank Harf signed on to Stewart's scheme, building a 32-foot diameter, 8-foot deep, 45,000-gallon tank for the white whale. The railroad smartly refused to handle the whale, so Stewart convinced U.S. Express to take charge. The first whale died in Cleveland. The second survived a freight car fire in her specially built tank box. Her whale ship's procession marched through over the Rhine and up the Main Street Incline. Her transfer into Harf's mighty tank was a troublesome affair, but the celebration went forth nonetheless that evening by the visiting Prussian military band playing a specially written whale march. Sadly, the song wasn't enough to save her from starvation. Stewart sent for his last beluga, who arrived in much better condition. The papers celebrated the whale's arrival, with a caveat to see it before it dies. The third whale thrived on a fish diet despite the tank being filled with Ohio River water contaminated with a mud slurry. The poor whale succumbed to the mud 10 days after arrival and remained in situ 10 more days before the stench caused its removal to Vine Street for embalming. Price Hill House and Gardens was the next attraction to open on July 14, 1875, which quickly earned the nickname Buttermilk Mountain to reflect the alcohol-free drink selection. General Price was a teetotaler, while his son William thought alcohol would cause drunken accidents on the incline. William's nephews put beer on the menu by 1885. Family-friendly entertainment focused on orchestras playing the latest European tunes while patrons sat in the 1,000-seat outdoor veranda gazing out toward the Queen City. Local kids soon learned to check below the veranda for dropped money the morning after a large gathering. Price Hill House social events were considered must-attend. Several labor unions also favored the venue for their annual picnic. A December 30, 1899 fire destroyed the Price Hill House, causing Incline ridership to languish until it was rebuilt in 1901. A pavilion was later added that housed vaudeville acts, silent movies, and heavyweight champ Jim Jeffries training for his next title defense. Jeffries was a big, fierce guy who was scared to death every time he had to ride the incline up from the valley. The pavilion was demolished in 1920, and the Price Hill House met Mr. Wrecking Ball in 1942 to clear space for WSAI's transmission tower. Bellevue House was considered the most beautiful building, rising magnificently from Elysian Clifton. Architect James McLaughlin's work boasted the longest bar in the city, dance hall, ballroom, bowling alley, and restaurant. Serving 100 kegs of beer was considered a good day. The house opened on Sunday, September 10, 1876, to huge fanfare, with evening performances by Courier's celebrated reed band. Over 1,000 people waited in line to enter the electric venue. Henry Hildebrand was the first proprietor, and David Billingheimer his successor. It was considered a haunted house by August 1890, serving mainly as a picnic ground. The building was remodeled into a streetcar house in 1895. On March 22, 1901, arsonists rendered the structure and streetcars inside a total loss amounting to $28,200, or today, $8.2 million in damages. Highland House was a popular Mount Adams Hilltop attraction featuring bowling alleys, billiards, smoking rooms, roller rink, gardens, Belvedere Pavilion, and restaurant. Benjamin Starr, with Courier's celebrated reed band, opened the establishment on December 16, 1876. The structure was financed by James Mooney and George Kerper. Architect George Rapp's design was considered classier than Lookout House, and Starr made sure to fill the grounds with events to match. A June 1877 dog show drew thousands of visitors, with the Independence Day celebration being so well attended a riot nearly occurred at the gatehouse amongst revelers eager to get up the hill. Benjamin Starr conceded management to Frank Harf by January 1879. The public agreed Harf's talents were better suited for the classier venue. Frank convinced the Cincinnati Orchestra to split time between Highland House and Price Hill. He also brought in the world-renowned Hessian military band. Frank Harf died unexpectedly in October 1886. George Kerper arranged for the funeral to be held at Highland House. The service was attended by thousands and given in German and English. Lookout House was never the same after Frank departed, becoming used by homeless before burning down on March 13, 1894. Highland House experienced a few more highs, including a famous 1887 summer concert series by Theodore Thomas, drawing over 8,000 people every night. Newspaper ads recommended leaving early as the Incline could only carry 2,000 people per hour. Popular New York Senator Roscoe Conkling's visit drew over 20,000 guests. The Fair Play Athletic Club later leased the house, and Cincinnati schools temporarily located classrooms on the first floor before the building was demolished in 1895. F.W. Brown wrote in 1900, "The novelty of the hilltops gradually wore away with a public accustomed to daily traveling up and down the inclines, and in less than 20 years from the date of the opening of the first of the once popular resorts, the last of the hilltop houses closed its doors as an active factor in public amusements, and the Price Hill House alone remains, a solitary reminiscence of a past and happy era." Ohio finally enforcing a Sunday alcohol sales ban certainly hurt revenue, but the glimmer had lost its glitz well before. In a way, entertainment fads are karma, as the hilltop attractions had shut down many over-the-Rhine beer gardens and opera houses. The hilltop houses in turn lost patrons to newer entertainment venues further from the city, such as Coney Island. However brief their tenure, George Smith's gambit left an indelible mark on the city. Nearly every Cincinnatian with deep ties to the area has heard family tell about riding the inclines. My grandfather often took his future bride up the Mount Adams incline for an afternoon Eden Park picnic. Yet the modern romance of the Seven Hills was a dream for Victorian Cincinnatians until a group of men heard of Pittsburgh's elevator. Cincinnati Incline Plain's 1872 experiment to solve the city overcrowding problem was a successful awakening, resulting in 3 more inclines on Price Hill, Mount Adams, and Clifton Heights within the decade. Ike Miller's plan in 1890 led to the Cincinnati Street Railway building his dream on Fairview Heights in 1894, closing the chapter on incline construction. Humanity streamed forth over the Seven Hills, building universities, a zoo, businesses, homes, and a new age of transportation. The 20th century brought better roads and automobiles, allowing people to control their personal transportation schedule. Author John White's grandmother best characterized the shifting mid-20th century attitude toward the incline as a novelty. The era ended in 1948 with Mount Adams' closure. There was still clearly a place for the incline amongst youth, young romantics like my grandparents, and families enjoying a beautiful Sunday afternoon. Films, pictures, stories, books, and Charles Lambert's operating scale model of the Mount Adams incline allow us to fondly remember these marvels of engineering. An urban adventurer can still find incline remains in places like Price Hill's Olden Park or along Clifton Avenue. However, George McDuffie offered the best lamentation. We hope you enjoyed this presentation of Cincinnati's inclines. Please consider visiting the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library, Cincinnati Museum Center, Cincinnati Transportation Historical Society, Price Hill Historical Society, or Cincinnati Railroad Club website at www.cincinnatyrrclub.org to learn more about the Queen City's vibrant transportation history.